our first speaker, who's now a traditional opening speaker for our events, John Gerzema, who's the CEO of the Harris Poll, which we've been partnering with it more and more. And as you'll hear, we're partnering with very specifically on a new project, which we're sort of unveiling today. And I'll let John quickly talk about that. And he's giving some preliminary results from that. So John, take it away.
Hey, David, how are you? Great to be with you guys. I'm going to share my screen and put up a few slides. I'm also going to make sure you guys have these slides so you're access to them. So what I'd love to do maybe is to kind of frame this discussion around digitally united by looking at the current state of Americans through our data through the Harris Poll, and sort of some custom questions that together we just asked over the weekend to try to understand the role of digital and technology sort of in this state of fragmentation as you described. So the first thing I'm going to do is share with you our fear chart. This is now well past 52 weeks of consecutively tracking sort of various COVID and other issues related to sort of the state of national anxiety, if you will. And you can kind of see early on, there was a lot of sort of, belief that this was irrational, 54% today, 68% now feel that the national fear is actually sensible. But what's been very encouraging is the fear has started to abate somewhat. We've started to see it tick down weekly on a number of different things like fear of leaving home, fear of losing one's job, fear of dying from COVID. But what's interesting to note, David, as you mentioned around fragmentation, is look at the uptick. The one area where we are seeing some significant points raised are two areas. One, sort of fear of a new wave of COVID as we look at the variants, but really look at the stress caused from political turmoil. That has been something that has continued to sort of hold steady. And that's part of the national attention moving away somewhat from COVID and starting to really reflect deeper about some of the other fissures in our society. Speaking of COVID, however, and these are all kind of interrelated as we look at some of the challenges, but there was a lot of vaccine misinformation, for example, on social media during the election. And if you look at our weekly waves, right around November, around November 7th, we hit the lowest in terms of the number of Americans that said that they would take the vaccine. That was at 58%. As of this past weekend, it's at 73%. But there's been a lot of issues within the various communities within America. And while those numbers on the right-hand side, you can see two waves from November to the dark brown as of this past weekend, we're starting to see those numbers tick down. But for instance, BIPOC people of color, especially Black Americans, have continued to be very wary of the vaccine, and really for good reason. This chart to me is very sobering, and it really speaks to how we need to really understand the Black experience when we think of systemic racism in our healthcare system, because there's a lot of mistrust. If you look at the difference between white Americans and Black Americans, white being the green bar, Black being the gray bar, we ask the question, how much do you trust the opinions of the following people when it comes to the COVID-19 vaccine? And just look at the deltas between trust on doctors, healthcare workers, pharmacists, and on the right-hand side, which of the following places would you feel comfortable to receiving a COVID-19 vaccine? Again, that same issue of those gaps. And maybe the bottom left, I'll just focus out there where it says, I do not trust anyone. And this is just because of the interrelation of all this misinformation and systemic racism, and really the national narrative. Again, David, your point on fragmentation, look at these two pie charts. The left one says, how much do you oppose or support the Black Lives Matter movement? And we continue to get strong support, almost 2/3 of Americans. But then look at the other side. Most Americans support both BLM and not defunding the police. They're open to a reform to police departments, but they want their resources intact. In fact, when you add that 44% to the 36% that ensure police departments enforce law and order as they have been, which is essentially no change than before the George Floyd killing and Breonna Taylor, you're really looking at a law and order society that really sort of has two various viewpoints on two social issues. Having said that, there is some reason for unity and optimism. This is, I guess, the focus of our conference. So what we have seen is that there's the start of a sense of a little bit more unity There is a more united group of Americans that say at 40% that post-COVID, we're starting to come together. And then this is sort of an interesting set of questions on the right that we asked around understanding if you've learned anything through the pandemic. And there's some nice thoughts here that kind of connect to our national values and our own sense of self. The pandemic taught me what it means to be an American. You have to be resilient and tough. Or I've missed America's attitude and unique brand of optimism and sense of opportunity, most notably, manifest through the moonshot speed of the pharmaceutical industry and its reaction to COVID and rushing out our vaccines. And then some other things that are really starting to talk about that sense of resolve. So maybe some hope there to kind of build on. And also an economic hope. In our recent Harvard-Harris poll that we just released at the end of last month, we got a new one coming out this Friday. We basically see under the new administration, the perception of the country is shifting toward the right track, where we're starting to see an uptick from 27% to 43%. And on the wrong track, declining from 63 to 47%. So people start to feel like things are turning around. And now we're going to get into digital sort of access through the pandemic and the digital divide as we see it through these new Techonomy Harris poll questions. The first thing we see is that, by and large, Americans give sectors really strong grades at digitally adapting to consumer needs, especially many of those sectors that we relied on daily and weekly, right? Retail, healthcare, food and beverage, pharmaceutical, drugs, restaurants, all of those scored very high in the 70s, less so some of the other industries like airlines, real estate, and media. But what you started to see was a lot of cross-generational digital adaptation. We talked a lot about digital acceleration in the media, but what's really interesting to note is how much sort of seniors were part of this. And you'll see that in some of the data. But by and large, you've got Americans saying that I'm using contactless transactions more, I'm using more QR codes, I'm using more augmented reality, the promise potentially to move from 2D to 3D as we start to think about how our online behaviors are going to exist post the pandemic. But again, really interesting how these sort of digital natives that we always ascribe to Gen Z and millennials were actually a function of a lot of penetration among Gen X and boomers. At 53% on contactless, for example. And you can see how this sort of basically worked its way around the country. So it was quite a ubiquitous movement toward digital. And I'll just take one sector real quickly, telehealth. Look at this, a lot of interest to continue using telehealth. Doctors' offices have been traditionally associated with catching germs, bad magazines, long wait times and filling out forms. Well, suddenly people got on to telehealth during the pandemic. And there's 65% that say they're likely to use it again in the future, including lots of different sectors, most notably 48% of those 64 plus. And again, if you were able to conduct much of your regular visits, we basically kind of see a third of market share being pulled out on an ongoing basis for telehealth versus traditional doctor visits. But now let's look at that digital divide. We asked a similar set of questions around access to digital hardware and to the internet. And you start to see the stark contrast that exists in what David described as our fragmented society. Black Americans, the green line, look at the difference where 1/3 of Black Americans roughly are saying my children, disagreeing with the statement, my children have the technology equipment needed to attend online school. 21% believe that they do not have access to reliable telehealth services, 1/5 of Black Americans. So again, you see that green line, how those numbers pop across access to mobile banking, right? 26%, 1/4 of Americans believe, Black Americans believe they do not have access to mobile banking, nor the technology equipment needed to work from home, 1/3 again of Black Americans. And then access to a reliable computer, almost 1/5. Similarly, access to a smartphone with reliable internet access. And then 16% not believing they have access to reliable, affordable, high-speed internet. Again, you can see on the blue line on the right-hand side how those numbers manifest themselves with the income gap, right? For people making less than 50,000 on those same questions. But really what becomes so difficult, and really I think maybe David and Josh and Team Jeb talk about, is really the moonshot, right? If we are going to work together to create digital unity and to really envision a more inclusive society, we have to understand the disagreement, again, that for example, Black Americans have, and BIPOC across our data, but I use Black Americans for the sake of this argument here briefly, across all the different things from upskilling to personal finances to education and health. And you can really see, again, Black Americans on the left with orange bars, basically not believing they have the resources necessary to develop new schools. This goes to coding, technical schools. That's 1/4 of Black Americans, a significant difference from white Americans at 18%. Or technology tools help me understand and improve my personal finances. I'll just let you kind of look across this list since we don't have a lot of time to go through things, but you can start to see, again, how racial disparities and income disparities really create this fissure, this divide that everyone talks about. But this is real life, right? This is, I can't get my kids access to homeschooling during the pandemic because I don't have access to the equipment. This is really where Americans are living at the moment. And we even saw this digital divide among Gen Z women in a recent Girl Up Harris poll report, again, showing how the pandemic disproportionately affected girls in learning here in the United States. So when we talk about this technology unity, there's first important to acknowledge a tech rift. We're basically seeing beyond the techlash, there's sort of two camps of tech that are emerging. And this is in our most recent RQ Reputation Quotient study. But we basically see Amazon, Hulu, Samsung, basically hardware manufacturers, Google, Microsoft, search marketers having a generally more favorable reputation than social media companies. Airbnb and Uber notwithstanding, you really see a major difference between, for example, Amazon and Microsoft and Twitter and Facebook with unfavorable ratings. And that's a function of some pretty interesting basket analysis that we did with our reputation data. So we ask a series of sort of different questions that make up the overall reputation quotient study that we designed. And you can see in here the difference in the baskets of the, let's say, quote unquote, as consumers call them, white hats and black hats. But this group of tech companies had a very different difference, sort of a different delta between different things like affinity, culture of the company in terms of American opinions, the ethics of the company's role in citizenship. But look at the big difference too noted in terms of the vision of the companies, whether Americans believe these companies are heading somewhere with purpose and conviction, and the growth prospects for these companies as well. Again, this is weighted to the national proportions of Americans in our country. This is not opinion elites talking about these companies. This is just people that are using these products and services and what they think. So you can start to see sort of this difference in tech that's sort of emerging. And that is because Americans do not trust social media platforms by and large. 7 out of 10, as a result of the events on January 6th, now believe that they should be distrusted. At 69%, the general public, that's even higher than Congress at 56%. And you can see other pillars of our democracy, from the justice system to voting by mail, large degrees of sort of mistrust and misapprehension. What's really important to understand is that GOP Republicans skew strongly against social media. They are far more likely to believe that social media is biased toward them, which does create the potential for some very real concern for sort of a bipartisan move on social media in our Harvard-Harris poll data. We asked a question, do you believe internet and social media platforms should be policing the actions and statements of their users according to their own set of rules? Or do we need to have legislation in place that determines how, when, and where these companies can do? And there's 43% that believe they can police their statements and take care of their business. But there's even more, the majority of Americans at 57% that believe we need legislation that really is forming their policies. And we look on the right, Are you concerned or not concerned that such legislation will be used to silence voices of dissent, minorities, or religious groups? That then becomes really the source of tension here. There is a strong degree of concern. Nearly 62% top two box believe that taking that kind of action is going to potentially silence dissenting minority or religious voices. Why this is so important, again, as you unpack the conference and the discussion with some really great experts coming up next, is to understand how do we sort of reconcile these concerns, because there is a lot of concern around this silencing and dissent. And in fact, 4 in 10 voters are concerned they could actually lose their job from their own social media postings. And we asked, do you think the firing of individuals by employers over their online or other content is largely justified, or has it gone too far? Look at that, 53% of Americans, the majority, are now splitting away and saying, you know what, this has gone too far. And in fact, 39% are concerned that they could lose their job from something that they posted on Facebook or Twitter or WhatsApp, including 43% of those making over 100K. So this isn't really just a populist issue. This is an issue across America that is really starting to concern people everywhere. And then we asked this question, do you think there's a growing cancel culture that is a threat to our freedom or not? And again, nearly 2/3 of Americans now believe that is a threat at 64%, including high degrees of Republicans, 8 out of 10, but also 2/3 of independents and nearly a majority of Democrats. So we look at this censorship, cancel culture. You can see here, there's disagreement on Amazon censoring books, for example. And that just gives us sort of a broad look at an understanding of some of our data, David, as we sort of look at things. But I think what's important as you get into this discussion is really understanding that there's opportunities for digital focus on access, to focus on tolerance, fairness, and inclusivity.
Yes, and some of the data that you shared about public attitudes will dovetail very nicely with speakers we're going to be hearing this very afternoon, who share the alarm of the general public on many of those points. And this idea that social media is the least trusted institution in a major institution is really amazing. I would like to just reiterate, this is early look into some data that Harris Poll and Techonomy are jointly going to be gathering. We're calling the American Progress Project. We'll be formally unveiling that later, but we're super pleased to be working with John and his wonderful team on that. And we think we're going to be able to surface some very important information going forward. So thank you, John, for continuing your traditional opening for our program. As always, super meaty. Thank you again.